Treaties signed, promises broken. In a struggle to save her people's very existence, hers was the lone female voice among a council of warriors, elders, and wise men responsible for deciding the fate of their people. For years, political maneuvering to separate her tribe from their ancestral homelands caused mounting tensions between two cultures that would never fully understand each other. One determined to explore and expand, the other bound by ancient customs and beliefs. Angered over the countless lies and broken promises of men thousands of miles away, many called for war. War against the violence perpetrated against her people. War against the waves of encroaching settlers and miners forcing them off their hunting lands. War against government policies threatening their way of life. War against a fate they had no control over. But she was a wise woman, a compassionate woman, a woman who knew the warlike ways of men would only lead to sorrow, suffering, and death. She understood the harsh reality her people would face if a war of anger and revenge prevailed. So she would counsel the warriors, the elders, and the wise men to fight a different kind of war. A war waged from the heart, not from horseback. A war based on a strategy of peace, not hatred. A war of wisdom, not guns and arrows. A war of diplomacy, not death. A war that would break her heart, but never her resolve. She knew in the end it would cost her people dearly, but she would fight this war her way to make sure her people would ultimately survive.
You've planted your dreams. It's time to release. No more fear. No more fear. Surrender in her. Trust you won't fall. Time to fly. Time to fly.
Hello, and thanks for joining me on another episode of the Aquitaine Project. I'm Marlo Mead, your host, guide, and fellow traveler, on a journey where together we draw upon the lessons, wisdom, and experiences of women past and present, women I call my bright lighters. Each episode, I'll bring to light their stories, voices, and legacies, and share with you lessons we can use in our own lives every day, shining their light from different centuries, cultures, and corners of the earth. They light the way, making it possible for each of us to create our own light and shine it forward. So if you're ready to meet this episode's bright lighter and learn a little, grow a little, laugh a little, and shine a lot, stick around.
Free your soul.
By the 1800s, the Nuuk, which means the people, known today as the Ute Nation, had lived in the Colorado Mountains for more than 500 years. 23 million miles of traditional hunting grounds, think most of Colorado, Utah, and northern New Mexico, was shared by a loose confederation of 13 Ute bands. The 7 eastern bands ranged primarily in present-day Colorado, while the 6 western bands roamed freely throughout present-day Utah. For centuries, the Utes maintained seasonal hunting grounds and a wandering way of life, with only nominal interference from European and American explorers, trappers, and traders. But all that would change as Western expansion opened the way for railroads, gold mining, and land grants. Between 1849 and 1880, the Utes experienced severe cultural transitions. A series of treaties made in good faith with the U.S. government stripped away their traditional hunting lands, seriously impacting their way of life, and established reservations on lands unfit for hunting or even farming. Anti-Indian legislation led to broken promises of autonomy, money, and supplies, and constant trespassing on Ute lands. Growing tension between the tribes and the settlers and miners increased raids on encroaching farms and settlements, while overzealous Indian Affairs agents, hell-bent on turning the Utes into farmers, caused fighting within and among the various Ute bands, instigated a bloody massacre, and fueled growing fears of a full-scale Indian uprising that had been looming on the horizon for decades. And at the center of the turmoil and years of anger and mistrust on both sides stands Chipeta, wife and trusted advisor to Chief Ute, leader of the Tabawash Utes. Traditionally viewed in the light of a peacemaker, which she absolutely was, Chipeta's wisdom, quiet strength, and devotion to peace was key in maintaining positive relationships between the Utes and white Americans, and in shaping the future of Colorado and, by extension, the rest of the country. But change was inevitable. Chipeta was painfully aware she was witnessing the decline of one way of life and the advance and dominance of another. She also knew she was powerless to stop it. Fighting the whites would not turn back the tide of immigrants flooding into her homelands. She believed the only solution was to engage in treaty negotiations to protect her people and their interests. Caught between colliding worlds, I believe this Colorado Brightlighter's innate understanding and acceptance of the differences between what she could control and what she could influence played a pivotal role in preventing war and ensuring the survival of her people. In 1845, a band of Ute Indians discovered a massacred Kiowa Apache camp. Among the bloody wreckage, they found a sole survivor, a little girl who would one day become wife of a chief, a skilled diplomat, and a dedicated advocate for her people. Given the name Chipeta, which means white singing bird by her adopted band, the Tabawash, commonly known as the Uncompahgre Utes, Chipeta grew up learning all the traditional women ways of the tribe. She became skilled at tanning hides and renowned for her beadwork. In 1859, at the age of 16, she married the well-respected hunter and Ute leader Ute, whose first wife, Black Mare, had died, leaving behind a young son. Chipeta grew into her role as mother and wife to Ute, who would eventually become chief of the Tabawash Utes and viewed by the U.S. government as the leader and representative of all the Ute people. Wise for such a young age, Chipeta became known for her sound judgment, compassion, bravery, and quiet strength. Chief Ute came to rely on her as his equal in tribal matters, his trusted advisor and confidant. Her wise counsel garnered her the respect of other chiefs and leaders of the various Ute bands, affording her the honor of becoming the first and only woman to hold a seat on the Ute Tribal Council. Hers became the voice of peace as the Utes struggled against the tides of change that had begun to erode their way of life. During the Colorado Gold Rush of 1858 and after passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, thousands of white immigrants poured into ancestral Ute lands in Colorado. As a consequence, conflicts between Native people and white settlers increased dramatically. As tensions rose and U.S. government pressure increased, Chipeta advised her husband to sign an agreement with the U.S. government in an attempt to end growing hostilities and restore the peace. Chipeta and Ute then traveled throughout Colorado working to educate Ute tribes about the treaty and to convince them of the benefits of finding a peaceful solution with the whites. In 1863, she and Chief Ute helped to create the first of 4 treaties between the Utes and the U.S. government, each of which would be broken during her lifetime. With each broken treaty, the Utes' feelings of mistrust, anger, and hatred towards the whites grew. It was during this time of conflict that Chipeta's foresight and the realization that, if push came to shove, her people could not survive an all-out war with the superior forces of the U.S. military became crystal clear. She knew for certain there were events at play that she had absolutely no control over. The push to claim more and more of her people's lands by the U.S. government, the discovery of gold and other valuable minerals in the Colorado mountains, and the almost fanatical desire to civilize not only her people but all the indigenous tribes across North America were all things she was helpless to change. So she resolved to use her considerable influence as a respected wise woman, peacemaker, and tribal leader to stem the tide of war and ensure the survival of her people the only way she believed possible, through peaceful diplomacy. But it would take all her strength, bravery, and wisdom to navigate this course. In 1879, tensions between the White River Utes and several other bands and U.S. Indian officials came to a head during an ambush and uprising against the White River Indian Agency, headed by Nathan Meeker, who had callously attempted to force the Utes to give up their traditional way of life. Meeker and 10 others were killed, and Meeker's family was taken hostage. Many of the Tabawash Utes wanted to join the uprising, but Chipeta stayed up all night with Ouray and other tribal leaders, convincing them not to ride to the aid of the White River Utes, who were in a battle with the U.S. cavalry. Doing so, she counseled, would risk any semblance of peace the Utes had left. Upon the release of the hostages, it was Chipeta who cared for them and wept with them over the violence and loss of life. Her compassion was as equally strong as her wisdom in the face of this horrible event. The following year, Chipeta and Ouray, along with other Ute leaders, were summoned to Washington, D.C. to answer questions about the Meeker massacre. There was a national outcry for the removal of all the Utes from Colorado, and when Chipeta was called to testify before Congress, she became the first woman ever to do so. Speaking through an interpreter, she answered questions, but really had no first-hand knowledge about the events. What she did try to convey was her continued belief in a peaceful resolution in the wake of the massacre and lobbied for the best outcome for her people. Despite Chipeta's efforts, the Meeker massacre gave the U.S. government the excuse they needed to solve the Ute Indian problem. After Chief Ouray's death in August 1880, Chipeta and the Tabawash Band, along with several other bands of Utes, were forced off their lands in Colorado and moved to the Uinta and Ouray Indian Reservation in Utah. The relocation hung heavy on Chipeta's heart, but the alternative would have been unbearable. Nearly blind and living in poverty on the reservation, Chipeta continued to support her people and advocate for peace until her death on August 17, 1924. By all accounts, Chipeta never for a moment wavered in her loyalty to her people or what she thought was the right course of action. She refused to worry about the many things she could not control. Even as she saw the shadow of doom on her people, she worked tirelessly, using all of her influence to bring about a peaceful transition during a volatile time in her people's lives. She knew that war meant the murder of hundreds of whites and the extermination of her people. This was not a future she was willing to accept. If her voice and her wholehearted belief in peace could influence the hearts, minds, and actions of others, she would give it everything she had, and more, to make it so. Chipeta's journey to ensure peaceful survival for the Utes was directed by her keen understanding that there were certain things happening in her ancestral lands and thousands of miles away that she and her people had absolutely no control over. Her goal was to focus solely on influencing the events they as a people and she as a leader could control. Some of you may be familiar with American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer in one form or another. The original verse goes like this: God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. This timeless prayer is great advice and is the epitome of Chipeta's unrelenting search for peace, as well as the foundation of the concepts of the circles of concern and the circles of influence, popularized by Stephen Covey, author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. What Chipeta knew over 300 years ago, we are still learning about today. Simply put, the circles, as I call them, inform us to focus on things we can control and not to waste our energy on things that we can't. Easier said than done, I know. But there are tons of resources available to get you acquainted with the ideas and practical steps to help you master them. And you know, as always, I've posted some of my favorites on the podcast episode page on the website for you to check out. Let me start by saying it's tough to accept that there are some things we read about, learn about, and care about that we can't change. We get bombarded daily about events happening halfway around the world or halfway around the country. People in crisis, countries in upheaval, the economy in a downward spiral. You get the picture. But what we need to acknowledge is that our energy and resources and our abilities, for the most of us, are finite. And we are better served by distinguishing between the things we can have an impact on and the things that we can't. Stephen Covey's circles are based on two concentric circles. The outer circle represents our areas of concern, while the inner circle represents our areas of influence and control. Okay, it goes kind of like this. Our circle of concern are things in our personal or professional lives that affect us, but that we have no control over, like wars, the weather, the economy, traffic, who the CEO of our company may be, and even death. Some things in my circle of concern include worldwide strife, the increase in violence in cities across the country, inhumanity of people and governments around the world, life on Mars, and the Colorado Avalanche standings. Now, can I, me, myself, and I control or influence any of these issues? Nope. Can I make myself anxious, upset, and unsettled worrying about them? Yep. Our circle of concern is where our energy tends to be wasted if we're not careful. Strolling through the news or watching endless YouTube clips about the end of the world, or getting sucked into those clickbait stories or rabbit holes we find ourselves going down. The point is to acknowledge there are things in the world that concern us, but not to focus our energy on them because they are out of our control. The second circle, our circle of influence, is a smaller circle and sits inside our circle of concern, is where we can be most proactive and where we should focus our attention. These are things we have absolute control over, such as our attitudes and our actions, the choices we make, the things we say, how we treat people, how we take care of ourselves, the causes we support, who we vote for, and what's happening in our neighborhoods. Think about it this way. Ending world hunger may be in your circle of concern, but you can't end world hunger by yourself. It just isn't in your control. What is in your control are actions you can take to influence hunger in your own community. You can work in a food bank or provide meals for people in need in your neighborhood, or you can donate to organizations that work to address food insecurity. The key is to focus our energy on those things that we can influence, because what we can influence, we can change. And the more we turn our attention to the things we can control, the larger our circle of influence becomes, making our circle of concern smaller. Here's a personal example. I have always been concerned about the safety and well-being of kids, and any time I read stories about child trafficking, murders or abuse, child neglect, or any type of violence perpetrated by or on kids, my heart would hurt, and sometimes I'd even cry. I still do. These issues have always been front and center in my circle of concern, but I realized years ago I had no control over what happened to kids in communities or homes hundreds of miles away. Focusing my time and energy being consumed by sorrow over these events changed nothing. It didn't help those kids, those families, or those communities. But when I shifted my focus from my circle of concern to my circle of influence and the actions I could take, I realized there were things I could do to make sure my kids, their friends, and the kids in my own neighborhood felt safe and cared for. So our house became the house where kids gathered after school and on weekends. I always made sure kids had a place to hang out if their parents weren't home yet. Things like hosting kiddie holiday cookie decorating parties, inviting the kids across the street to help decorate our tree in the front of the yard. I pay them in cookies, of course. Paying kids on the block to do yard work and teaching them value of a hard day's work. And every summer, my husband would start up a street hockey league, and every kid in the neighborhood participated. There was even a traveling trophy that went home with the MVP of each game. You should have seen the pride on those kids' faces when they won that trophy. Those kids are all grown up now, except for the boys across the street who work for cookies. And when they come by to visit, they still mention how much fun it was hanging out in the basement or playing street hockey till it was too dark to see the ball. I guess my point is, like Chipeta, I knew certain things were out of my control. I knew I had no power to affect the lives of kids I read about in the news as much as I may have wanted to. So, like her, I focused my energies on what I could control and the actions I could take to have a positive impact on the lives of the kids in my circle of influence. Kids I will always consider my people. When we learn to focus our time, energy, and resources on those things in our lives we have influence over and can control, we become more productive and positive in our approach to ourselves, our problems, our relationships, and the world at large. Taking the time to understand and identify what we can and cannot control is, dare I say, absolutely within our circle of influence. As the only woman to sit on the Ute Tribal Council and the first woman to testify before the U.S. Congress, Chipeta took up the mantle of peacemaker and led her people through treacherous, violent times with quiet strength, dignity, and compassion. She used her voice to counsel peaceful coexistence when many wanted to go to war. She showed compassion to those whose very presence in her ancestral lands meant the end of her way of life. She became a bridge between cultures, always seeking solutions that would prevent bloodshed, heartache, and death for people on both sides. Above all else, she was committed to ensuring the survival of her people. She knew that in choosing one's battles, sometimes peace is better than being right. One of her greatest gifts to the Utes was her wisdom in knowing and accepting there were things they just could not change, and she had the courage to take a stand and influence decisions that could ultimately decide between life and death. Due to her foresight and willingness to make very difficult decisions about the fate of her people, her legacy and her people live on. In honor of Chipeta, peacemaker and wise woman, let's challenge ourselves to take time to really understand what it means in our own lives, to acknowledge the things that we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Why I love this woman. She stood at the crossroads of survival or certain annihilation. As heart-wrenching as it was, she chose a path of peace to ensure the survival of her people. When I think of the life and times of Chipeta, White Singing Bird, I can't help but wonder why she so thoroughly embraced her roles as wise woman, peacemaker, and tribal leader. Yes, she was the wife of a chief, but she could have taken her place among the other women of her tribe and diligently worked to support her people in more common ways. I believe what drove Chipeta to rise to the occasion and serve her people in a leadership role was her clear understanding of the very real peril her people faced during the country's period of Western expansion. She knew her people had a choice to make: stand against the uncontrollable tide of white immigrants flooding their country and end up fighting an unwinnable war, or acknowledge the lack of control over their situation and focus on the things they could control, like ending the raids on farms and settlements, learning to farm in addition to hunting, and as difficult as it may have been, learning not to judge all white people by the broken promises of the U.S. government. As a well-respected member of the Tribal Council, she chose survival and used her wisdom and compassion to influence the outcome of events when and where she could. She and her people were stuck between a rock, the mighty force of the United States Army, and a hard place, the inhospitable lands of the Utah Reservation. Chipeta chose the hard place. Chipeta is the bright lighter who teaches me a wise woman knows the difference between her circle of control and her circle of influence, and that this knowledge can make all the difference in the world. To learn more about Chipeta and her struggles to ensure the survival of her people in the face of overwhelming odds, click on her beautiful portrait on the Aquitaine Project website episode page. There you'll find links about her life, accomplishments, and her relentless quest for peace. And make sure to check out her video produced by the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame Great Colorado Women series. On the episode page, you'll also find resources to learn more about the importance of recognizing the things in our lives that we can and cannot control. Let's connect on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Or feel free to drop me an email at theaquitaineproject@gmail.com. And I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, my Brightlighters, focus on the things in your life you can control. Light up your circle of influence and inspire your sisters to do the same.